Hey everyone, today we're diving into another chilling and disturbing case. If you'd like to support my channel, don't forget to subscribe and stay engaged. It really makes a big difference, and I truly appreciate it. Let's jump in. Violent crimes often capture widespread attention and quickly become the center of countless rumors and speculation. Investigations carried out in the early stages usually stand a much better chance of cracking the case swiftly. Paying close attention to even the smallest details is key, but sometimes, the most critical clues emerge from the most unexpected places. In the spring of 2010, a quiet town in Illinois was rocked by news of a brutal triple homicide. The victims were two men and a woman, all from the same family. The Kramer family was well off and widely respected in their community, which initially led investigators to suspect that this might have been a robbery gone terribly wrong. However, as detectives dug deeper, it became clear that the situation was far more complicated, twisted, and unpredictable than anyone could have anticipated. Lori and Jeffrey Kramer had been friends since high school, and by their final year, their friendship had blossomed into a romantic relationship. As soon as they turned 18, they got married and never looked back. Not long after tying the knot, they decided to leave the hustle and bustle of city life behind and move to the peaceful town of Darien in DuPage County, Illinois, just southwest of Chicago, with a population of a little over 20,000 residents. In 1986, they welcomed their first child, a son named Anthony. 2 years later, they had their daughter, Angela. And in the early 1990s, their youngest, Michael, completed the family. All three children were deeply wanted and were raised with love and dedication. Lori and Jeffrey were committed parents, making sure their kids had everything they needed, including a good education. Back in the mid-180s, Jeffrey launched a small auto repair shop in Darien, where he worked on cars and built up a reputation in the community. Jeffrey's passion wasn't limited to cars. He was also talented with motorcycles, often repairing them with his own two hands. His reputation as someone who could fix almost anything spread quickly throughout the community. As word of his abilities grew, so did his business. What started as a modest repair shop steadily expanded into a large service center that began attracting customers from across the county. Thanks to the success of the business, the Kramers were able to purchase a spacious home in one of the safest and most desirable neighborhoods in town. Each family member had their own car, and the children were enrolled in top-ranked schools. Lori and Jeffrey gave their kids the freedom to explore their own interests and dreams without placing heavy expectations on them. Anthony, the eldest, was studying economics and had dreams of eventually moving to Chicago. Though he enjoyed his independence, he chose not to leave home just yet. Instead, he turned the basement into his own personal apartment, complete with a bathroom, kitchen, and a large bedroom, though it was still only accessible through the main house. Angela was pursuing a degree in architecture and was also contemplating a future in a larger city, but for now, she remained at home. Michael, the youngest, had recently finished high school and planned to stay in Darien to work alongside his father. Having spent much of his youth helping out at the family shop, he shared his dad's passion for working with vehicles and dreamed of one day taking over the family business. Despite being young adults, all three Kramer children continued living at home. The family was known for being tight-knit and genuinely happy. They rarely fought and were always supportive of one another. Neighbors described them as kind, friendly, and generous, the type of people always ready to help out. From the outside, it seemed like they had no enemies and were admired by everyone in the community. But things were not as perfect as they appeared. In the early hours of March 2, 2010, around 2:30 a.m., emergency services in Darien received a desperate call from a young woman. Her voice was barely above a whisper as she pleaded for help for herself and her family. Her words shook with fear. Her voice trembled with fear, making it difficult for the dispatcher to understand exactly what she was saying. As investigators later learned, the caller had taken refuge inside a closet and wasn't sure what was unfolding inside the house, only that she had heard at least 10 gunshots. Though her words were jumbled, she managed to provide the address and begged the dispatcher to send help as quickly as possible. That address was the home of the Kramer family. When police arrived at the scene, the gunfire had already stopped, but the lights inside the house were still on. One of the first things they noticed was someone climbing out of a basement window. Initially, officers feared it might be the suspect trying to flee, but they soon realized it was Anthony Kramer, the eldest son. Anthony, too, had heard the gunshots and had been hiding, unsure of what to do. When he finally heard the sound of approaching sirens, he decided to escape, but terrified of running into the shooter, he chose to crawl out through the basement window rather than risk going through the house. Officers quickly moved Anthony to a safe area and instructed him to stay put while they cleared the residence. The front door showed no signs of forced entry, and once inside, the officers were met with a grim scene. On the staircase, they found a man lying in a large pool of blood. It was Jeffrey Kramer, the family patriarch, who had been shot twice in the chest at close range. He was already deceased. Just above him, on the steps, lay his wife, Lori. She had suffered fatal wounds to the abdomen and head and showed no signs of life. Further down the hallway, near the open door leading to the garage, officers found another victim, face down in a pool of blood. It was Michael, the youngest of the Kramer children. He had been shot 3 times in the back. Though first responders detected a faint pulse when they reached him, tragically, Michael did not survive the ambulance ride to the hospital and was pronounced dead en route. Inside the house, investigators also noted multiple bullet holes in the walls near the staircase and found large caliber shell casings scattered nearby. Shell casings were scattered across the floor. In the living room, a window had been smashed, likely the point of entry for the intruder or intruders. But one critical question remained: where was the young woman who had called 911? Was she unharmed? Was she even still alive? Angela was eventually discovered upstairs, still hidden inside a closet, frozen in shock. She had to be carefully helped out of the house, passing by the bodies of her family members, a moment that caused her to break down completely. Overcome with grief, she screamed and sobbed uncontrollably. Before the police could question her, she needed immediate medical care. The only people who had survived the attack were Angela and her brother Anthony, but neither could offer much information. Anthony had been in his basement apartment when the gunfire began. Unfortunately, his phone was left upstairs in the living room, leaving him unable to call for help. Paralyzed with fear and worried about encountering the shooter, he chose to stay hidden until he heard the sound of police arriving. Angela, meanwhile, had been asleep in her bedroom when the violence erupted. As soon as she heard gunshots, she ran to her parents' room but found it empty. More shots followed, and she quickly grabbed her phone, hid in a closet, and called 911. She remained there until officers located her. Neither sibling had seen the attacker. They couldn't say how many people were involved or give any descriptions. The crime scene offered very little in terms of physical evidence aside from the scattered shell casings. From the very start, investigators faced significant challenges. With almost no clues to work from, they were forced to explore every possible lead, even those that initially seemed unlikely. The Kramer family was financially comfortable and well known in the community. Their home was filled with expensive possessions, which at first pointed to the possibility of a home invasion that had spiraled out of control. Initially, this seemed like the most plausible explanation. However, the condition of the house didn't align with that theory. Nothing had been taken. Jewelry boxes, luxury watches, and high-end electronics were all untouched. All of the valuables, jewelry, luxury watches, and high-end electronics were left in plain sight and untouched. There were no signs of the home being ransacked, and the family's safe hadn't even been tampered with. According to statements from Anthony and Angela, the intruder had been inside the house for no more than 3 to 5 minutes. In other words, whoever carried out this brutal attack had entered by breaking a living room window, opened fire, killed the homeowners and their youngest son, and fled the scene, all without taking a single thing. This pointed strongly toward a personal motive. Investigators began to suspect that someone in the family may have been deliberately targeted, or perhaps the entire family had been. With this possibility in mind, law enforcement started to look more closely at the two surviving family members, Angela and Anthony. Although both were adults, they still lived at home and didn't appear to be deeply involved in steady work. Their comfortable lifestyle was largely funded by their father's successful auto repair business. Detectives had to explore whether underlying tensions in the household could have escalated to violence. One theory floated early on was that the older siblings, perhaps feeling stuck in their small-town life, had wanted to gain control of the family's wealth, including the significant savings and the thriving business. According to this line of thinking, they might have planned to sell the house and the auto shop, split the proceeds, and start fresh somewhere else. Michael, the youngest, could have been seen as an obstacle not just because he wanted to stay and run the shop with his father, but also because fewer heirs meant a larger share of the inheritance for those left behind. As disturbing as this theory was, it was eventually ruled out. Both Anthony and Angela were clearly devastated, openly mourning the loss of their parents and brother. Then, just as the investigation was hitting a standstill, police received new information from an unexpected source, someone who would soon become central to the case. While detectives were still processing the crime scene, interviewing the surviving siblings, and canvassing the neighborhood for witnesses, a young woman approached the Kramer residence. She was visibly distraught, tears streaming down her face as she frantically asked about Michael. She insisted she had crucial information to share and revealed that she had been inside the house during the attack. Her name was Samantha, a 19-year-old who had been Michael's girlfriend since their high school days. The two were longtime sweethearts, and both families supported their relationship. In fact, Michael and Samantha had even begun talking about getting engaged soon. On the night of the tragedy, the Kramers had invited Samantha over for a family dinner. They spent a warm, cheerful evening together, and Samantha decided to stay the night with Michael. Around 11 p.m., Jeffrey and Lori went to bed, followed shortly by Angela and Anthony heading off to their rooms. Michael and Samantha lingered in the living room, planning to watch a movie together. But partway through the film, they both drifted off to sleep on the couch. Around 2:30 a.m., Samantha was abruptly woken by the sharp sound of shattering glass. Disoriented, she at first assumed it might be a sound effect from the movie. Michael woke up as well, and together they looked around in confusion just in time to see a shadowy figure climbing through the broken window. Samantha was unable to offer much of a description. The intruder was dressed entirely in black, wearing a mask that concealed their face. Without warning, the masked figure pulled out a handgun and fired toward them while they were still frozen in shock on the couch. The bullet struck the wall nearby, snapping them into action. Realizing the danger, Michael and Samantha bolted for the nearest exit, the door leading to the garage. Michael pushed the door open and, in a heroic moment, shielded Samantha with his body, urging her to escape. Tragically, as Samantha rushed through the doorway, Michael was shot 3 times in the back at close range. But his brave action gave Samantha just enough time to make it outside and run for safety. In her panic, she believed Michael was right behind her and didn't immediately realize he hadn't made it out. Samantha ran for several blocks without once looking back, convinced the attacker was chasing her. Eventually, she found herself on a deserted street and cautiously glanced around, but no one was there. Her phone was still inside the Kramers' living room, so she tried to get help by knocking on the door of the first house she came across. Unfortunately, either the residents were away or fast asleep, because no one answered. Then, to her horror, she heard footsteps approaching. Overcome with fear that the attacker was following her, Samantha crawled beneath a nearby porch and hid, trembling. She remained there for nearly an hour, too terrified to move. Eventually, still shaken, Samantha gathered the courage to make her way back toward Michael's house. From a distance, she saw the flashing red and blue lights of police cars and hurried toward the scene. Officers stopped her before she could enter, but from where she stood, Samantha caught a glimpse of the bodies inside. When she realized Michael was gone, her heartbreak was overwhelming. Despite her obvious grief, investigators couldn't overlook the possibility that Samantha herself might somehow be involved. They briefly considered whether someone jealous, perhaps an infatuated admirer, had tried to remove Michael and killed the others as witnesses. But that theory quickly went cold, as no clear suspects emerged. The investigation took a new turn when Angela, during questioning, brought up a surprising name. Asked whether anyone might have held a grudge against the family, Angela mentioned Johnny Borisov, an ex-boyfriend she had broken up with just a couple of months earlier after a heated argument. Johnny and Angela shared a young son, and their relationship had been complicated from the start. Initially, Angela had been dating Johnny's best friend, Stephen, who had tragically died in a car accident along with his father about 3.5 years earlier. In the aftermath of that tragedy, Johnny had been there to support Angela through her grief, and over time, their friendship turned into romance. About a year later, Angela became pregnant. She and Johnny decided to marry, and he moved into the Kramer family home. But as time passed, it became clear that Johnny had certain expectations from the relationship, expectations that would soon lead to tension and conflict. Johnny had come to expect a life of comfort without putting in much effort. He leaned heavily on the Kramer family's financial support, showing little interest in holding down a steady job. On top of that, Johnny had a quick temper, manipulative tendencies, and serious struggles with anger management. In the months leading up to the tragedy, Johnny had been pressuring Angela to convince her parents to buy them a separate house. When that didn't happen, his frustration grew, and he began deliberately sowing discord between Angela and her family. It was this toxic behavior that ultimately led to their breakup. The couple never made it down the aisle, and now they were locked in a bitter custody battle over their young son. Interestingly, on the night of the murders, Johnny had picked up the child and taken him to his parents' apartment, but Johnny himself didn't stay there. With a clear motive and a troubled past, Johnny quickly became the main suspect. Police brought him in for questioning almost immediately. While his motive seemed strong, investigators still needed solid evidence to connect him to the crime. During the interrogation, Johnny claimed he had spent the entire night at a casino and hadn't left once. That alibi was later confirmed by the casino's surveillance footage, which showed Johnny on the premises the whole night. Even so, detectives weren't ready to let him off the hook. His behavior raised suspicions, and investigators began to wonder whether Johnny had hired someone else to carry out the attack. Given his strained relationship with the Kramers and his history, it was a theory they couldn't ignore. Further digging revealed that Johnny had prior run-ins with the law, mostly related to the distribution of illegal substances. Although he had been arrested multiple times, he always seemed to avoid serious punishment. Notably, though, none of his previous charges had involved violence. Then, about half an hour after the horrific events at the Kramer house were reported, the local police received another call, one that initially seemed completely unrelated. A young man phoned in, his voice shaking with distress and on the verge of tears. He claimed that someone was following him, and that he was being chased through town. The caller turned out to be a man named Jacob. Later, it came to light that Jacob had a history of emotional instability, including struggles with depression and anxiety. Under normal circumstances, his call to the police might have been brushed off as a false alarm if not for one critical connection. For the past several months, Jacob had been living with Johnny Borisov. After his breakup with Angela, Johnny had no interest in moving back in with his parents, but he also couldn't afford his own place. That's when he found a roommate, Jacob. Jacob was a quiet, timid, and highly impressionable young man. Raised in a strict religious household, he was used to following orders and rarely questioning authority. Since his teenage years, Jacob had wrestled with anxiety, various phobias, and episodes of depression, making him particularly vulnerable to influence. A background check confirmed that Jacob had no prior run-ins with the law. Those who knew him described him as polite but socially withdrawn, maybe a little odd, but certainly not violent. While some suspected he was grappling with untreated mental health issues or possibly even substance use, no one had ever imagined him as a threat. Meanwhile, since there was no direct evidence or formal charges against Johnny, police could only hold him for informal questioning, meaning he was free to come and go as he pleased. During the interview, Johnny repeatedly stepped out to make phone calls and constantly texted someone, raising suspicions among investigators. Concerned, they quickly secured a warrant to examine his phone records. What they found deepened the mystery. Johnny's recent calls and messages were directed to a contact saved as J, which turned out to be Jacob, the same young man the police were now struggling to locate. The contents of the messages weren't overtly incriminating, but they revealed something unsettling. Johnny appeared to be trying to calm Jacob down, repeatedly urging him to keep quiet and not say anything that could cause trouble. In recent years, Jacob had become distant from his own family, barely speaking to his parents, and had increasingly isolated himself, living under Johnny's roof. Before moving in with Johnny, Jacob had been living with his grandparents. Authorities reached out to the elderly couple, but they hadn't heard from their grandson in quite some time. Jacob had promised to visit soon, but he never followed through or called back. His grandparents confirmed that Jacob had struggled with depression since childhood. Over the years, he also experienced bouts of paranoia and had even been treated at a mental health facility. Despite his challenges, Jacob was resistant to medication. He firmly believed he could manage his condition on his own and often refused the treatments prescribed by doctors. Jacob's family had long been uneasy about his friendship with Johnny. They believed Johnny was a negative influence who might be exploiting Jacob's vulnerability. But with both men living independently as adults, the family had no way to step in. As previously reported, Johnny had a criminal background related to distributing illegal substances. After moving in together and learning about Jacob's mental health struggles, Johnny offered his roommate a dangerous alternative. He encouraged Jacob to use psychoactive substances to cope. It didn't take long before Jacob became dependent. And when Jacob couldn't afford his next fix, Johnny would provide it in exchange for favors. Over time, Jacob fell under Johnny's complete control, a vulnerable young man manipulated by someone who clearly knew how to exploit his weaknesses. A troubling picture began to take shape, and suspicions around the pair deepened. Investigators increasingly believed Johnny may have orchestrated a revenge plot against his ex-girlfriend's family, using Jacob as the pawn. Given Jacob's emotional instability and addiction struggles, it was possible he hadn't fully understood what he was being drawn into. Then, another critical detail surfaced. About a month before the tragic events at the Kramer home, Jacob had legally purchased and registered a .40 caliber handgun. How someone with a documented history of mental health issues was able to obtain a firearm raised serious questions. The mystery of how Jacob was able to purchase a firearm remains unresolved. It appears that a thorough background check wasn't conducted, and he was sold a gun, supposedly for self-defense. The weapon he acquired matched the model and caliber of the one used in the Kramer case, but a ballistics test was necessary to confirm whether it was the same gun. Several other pieces of circumstantial evidence also pointed to Jacob's possible involvement. But one major question still lingered: where was Jacob? On March 4th, Jacob's worried parents contacted the police to report something out of the ordinary. For the first time in over 2.5 years, their son had unexpectedly shown up at their home. He was visibly nervous, acting erratically, and desperately asked them to hide him, even if only for a short while. According to Jacob, some gang members were after him, allegedly hired by the head of a local drug trafficking ring because he had failed a mission. Jacob appeared to be under the influence of illegal substances and was experiencing another episode of paranoia. He drew the curtains, warned his parents not to approach the windows or answer the phone, and then went down to the basement, where he fell asleep on an old couch. By the time law enforcement arrived, Jacob had slept off some of the effects of the substances and was more coherent. He was taken in for questioning and shared an unsettling story, one he seemed to believe without question. He asked for only one thing in return: that the police ensure his parents' safety from the so-called gangsters, and in exchange, he would confess everything. Jacob claimed that it was Johnny who had introduced him to illegal substances and had been regularly supplying him. The issue, Jacob said, was that he couldn't always afford to pay for the drugs, and his debts had begun to mount. That's when Johnny allegedly told him that he was connected to a powerful cartel and that they were already aware of Jacob's unpaid balance. Even worse, Jacob claimed Johnny had convinced him that his ex-girlfriend Angela had discovered his supposed ties to the cartel. Jacob was told by Johnny that Angela, out of revenge, planned to expose him to the drug dealers. He claimed that the cartel boss had found out and ordered her silencing, with Jacob being tasked to carry it out as payment for his growing debt. Jacob, terrified and feeling cornered, believed every word of the story. He feared for his life and his family's safety. What he didn't realize was that the entire story, from the cartel to the hit order, was fabricated by Johnny to manipulate him into carrying out an act of revenge against Angela and her family. Under Johnny's influence, and in a state of heightened paranoia, Jacob broke into the Kramer home by smashing a window. He immediately encountered Michael and his girlfriend, who were asleep on the couch, and he chased them down, fatally shooting Michael. The sound of the gunshots woke Jeffrey and Lori, who rushed to the stairs, only to be gunned down as well. Afterward, Jacob didn't encounter any other family members. Overcome with panic, he fled the scene. At some point, believing he was being pursued by gang members for failing the mission, he made a terrified call to emergency services. This phone call became a pivotal breakthrough in the investigation, providing crucial leads that helped solve the crime quickly. Jacob eventually revealed the location where he had hidden the weapon used in the killings, along with the clothes he had worn that night. This evidence, along with his confession, allowed authorities to reconstruct the events and confirm both Jacob's and Johnny's involvement in the tragic murders. However, detectives were concerned that Johnny might try to shift the blame or manipulate the legal process. In a strategic move, they placed both suspects in the same interview room and told them to wait for a few minutes while the investigator returned. Once alone, Johnny began pressuring Jacob to take full responsibility, claiming that if he didn't, the gang members would harm his family. What Johnny didn't know was that the room was under surveillance, both audio and video. Every word he said was recorded, and it confirmed everything the detectives had suspected about his role in manipulating Jacob. Ultimately, Jacob agreed to a plea deal to avoid the death penalty. He was sentenced to 75 years in prison, with no possibility of parole, effectively a life sentence. Johnny received the same fate, life behind bars without any chance of early release. Despite multiple appeals, all of Johnny's efforts to overturn the decision have been unsuccessful. Thank you for watching. Your support means a lot. Please help my channel grow by hitting the like button, commenting, and sharing this video. Your engagement truly makes a difference. See you soon.